Hello everyone, welcome to Attorney Screening. Today we're doing another Hooptober review, and this time we're reviewing Dark Floors from 2008, directed by Pete Risky, a Finnish director. He's Finnish, which is notable because Finland won Eurovision once. And who did they win Eurovision with? They won it with Lordi, who star in this film. Their debut feature, I believe. I'm not too caught up on my Lordi lore. And I haven't done my revision. Maybe they've been in other films.
Your Eurovision.
Jesus Christ. And yeah, this is a film, I believe, with a great deal of creative input from Lordi, who obviously have a great affinity for all things horror. One would presume from how they dress up.
Affinity? Because they're Finnish.
That doesn't even work. That was just awful.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
The film is kind of like a hospital mystery, what's going on, with various demons chasing them. The demons are Lordi. There's no heavy metal music in it, which I thought was deeply disappointing. But outside of that, what did you think of Dark Floors starring Lordi?
Well, you know what? In spite of a lot of the negative reception this film seems to have received, I actually found it quite enjoyable. Like, it's definitely, to a degree, I wouldn't call this a particularly mind-blowing or exceptional horror film. But in terms of setting up the premise of, oh my god, Lordi made a horror film, I did kind of fear the worst. And while this is kind of a boilerplate demon, supernatural, sort of haunted house film, where they kind of go to different floors and there's a different demon chasing them, the creativity of Lordi's costumes really kind of helps make each area they go to and each demon, each character feels very specific and has their own kind of abilities or just design quirks that lend themselves to like a new spin on the horror that they're trying to get out. The acting is very plain down the middle, but it didn't offend me. It was perfectly serviceable horror acting as it goes. And yeah, I just thought it was a reasonably entertaining bump in the night kind of horror film.
It was just so the opposite of what I expected that it sort of took some adjustment watching it, because hearing that Lordi has made a horror film, I thought, right, okay, it's going to be schlock. It's going to be silly, you know, just like go on Wikipedia, look up some of their like song titles or like Spotify or whatever. Just go and look at them. They're very, very tongue-in-cheek, sort of 80s shock rock inspired. You think this is going to be an 80s, you know, monster flick, because they're all about, you know, spooky monsters and like weird gore and silly stuff like that. And yet this film is a weird, multi-dimensional time loop psychological horror, which takes itself extremely seriously.
For sure,
which I just wasn't expecting. And, you know, once I got past this kind of surprise at what the film was really going for, given how panned it seems to be on everything, it's really not that bad. But I still don't think it's good. Okay.
No, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to call it good. I agree with you completely that it does feel like a bit of a missed opportunity to kind of cash in on the Lordi vibe. You've got these striking visuals that they do a great job with, but there should be a bit more, I think, music, some theatricality to it. Like, I don't understand why you wouldn't. When we put this on, to begin with, I was thinking, oh, maybe they'll kind of go like the Kiss route of making it like really playing into the glam of what they're doing. And no, it feels far more like a film of the era, like a, I don't know,
just like standard
like
2000s,
like an Insidious type film. Like it feels, it's visually, there's a kind of monochrome color palette to it with a kind of sort of like steel blues and like mostly sort of greys and things like that. It felt very
Scandinavian.
Well, it felt Scandinavian, but it felt of the era massively. I don't know what it is about sort of late noughties to early 10s filmmaking and particularly horror filmmaking, but those were just kind of the colours you went with. There was just this very sort of like cold but like crisp look to these things. It is kind of weirdly generic in that aspect of things, in the visual aspect. But then, like you say, when you come to the storyline, it's kind of mental. Two key characters are a father and his, you know, mentally challenged daughter who is maybe autistic. It's kind of unclear. I
think she's definitely autistic.
Is she definitely autistic?
Because the film's sort of painting her as sort of unable to communicate but not mentally slow or something.
Okay, right.
So that has to be autistic.
Yeah. So that's her key thing, is she can't really communicate, and so they're in the hospital trying to do some stuff, you know, some CAT scans, trying to work things out about how to help aid her condition. And then it seems as though she's being communicated to via these demonic entities played by Lordi, which is confusing. Just to get this straight, there is a character within Lordi called Mr. Lordi. So when I say Lordi, I mean the band. And if I say Mr. Lordi, I mean the one dude.
Please, Mr. Lordi is my father.
Yes, so that's kind of your intro to the conceit. They get into an elevator, and then once they're in the elevator, there's a point where it stops, all the lights black out, and then when they leave the elevator from that point onwards, it seems as though they're in an alternate dimension.
So the same floor, but there's no one there.
Yeah.
And it's creepy.
Yeah, and then, gradually they find more and more demons. There's the lower down the hospital they go.
Right.
And there's one point where they look out the window and they realise time has frozen. Like the rain that's splashing on the side of the glass has stopped, which is bizarre. I'm struggling to think of what this reminds me of.
It reminded me slightly of a film with John Cusack in it called Identity, which was a sort of similar sort of bottle film concept that is very different in many ways, but it's a similar sort of setup. A lot of people end up in this sort of one location, and you have these sort of two running storylines that ends up, it's in his head, whatever. And like the characters are more symbolic than they are actually characters. I think that sort of leads me to my bigger problem with the film, is that whilst it's really shooting for these kind of odd concepts and interesting ideas, it doesn't seem to really know what to do with any of those. And the characters that Lordi played, the demons, it's never really clear what they represent. They're never really incorporated in any meaningful way into the story. They just kind of show up and then go.
Yeah.
And then by the end of the film, it makes a sort of point. So I guess this is spoilers. If you haven't watched Dark Floors, which I can't imagine you have, and you really care about spoilers, stop the video
You're a big Lordi
right
fan.
now.
If you're a big Lordi fan, what the fuck are you doing?
Yeah, how come
Have
you haven't
not
seen
Dark
it?
Floors?
Shocking
Calm the
behaviour.
fuck on.
Absolutely terrible. But at the end of the film, it's sort of, I can't remember exactly how it gets to it, but the guy gets like killed, and then it cuts back to the girl in the CAT scanner thing, right?
Yeah.
And then this time she drops a blue crayon instead of a red crayon when she's drawing her pictures. So it implies there's this sort of loop. And is this going to happen again? Or
Is things going to happen differently this time? Has she escaped the loop? Is that what it's signifying?
Yeah, I don't know. It just seems very convoluted for what reason, I don't know.
No. Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like the ambiguity there, in my mind, resembles the writers not knowing what to do with the concept than using it to aid a specific story element or point. Yeah, it feels like, oh shit, we've written ourselves into a corner. How do we resolve this film? Oh, it turns out she's the chosen one. She turns into a giant beam of light against the evil, dark Mr. Lordi, who is some kind of angel of death.
Final boss.
Yeah, with black goo everywhere. And then she's back at the start and no one is dead anymore. But are they gonna die again?
Yeah.
Who knows?
I think it's impressive how the film does manage to incorporate, the keyboard player from Lordi in a way that isn't completely laughable. I think the film does, it incorporates all the different sort of silly costumed members of Lordi, like Mr. Lordi, who, when you see him in real life, looks a bit ridiculous. But this film does look genuinely kind of creepy.
Yeah.
I think it's impressive how the film manages to incorporate all those things in a way that almost sort of suits the film's tone. I still think there's a little bit of clash there in terms of these oddly costumed Finnish metal musicians dressing up in a film and then going like, "Rah."
But I think the fact that they are, in the context of the band, dressing up in a demonic fashion, they've essentially stripped all of the camp away from the music side of things and just reduced them to a pure aesthetic piece of design.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it means that those characters are far more malleable. You can just do with them what you would, whatever you want. They are essentially just extravagantly designed ghosts. I mean, because essentially they go to a new floor and they're haunted by something else.
There's one very easy fix for this. I think the problem is that there's never any reference in the film to them outside of them just appearing. So and there's one really easy fix for that, and that's just the little girl is drawing pictures of them or something, right?
Right.
That gives you some kind of... I think the reason they didn't do that is it's a really clear indication of the sort of ambiguous, odd way the film's going, right? If she's drawing them, you'd be like, oh, right, this is in her head, right? This is some kind of...
yeah.
So I think that's why they don't do that. But then at least if you do that, the film has a kind of internal logic.
Yes, yeah, that's a good shout. What if Lordi exists in this real world? She's a huge fan of Lordi. She's like listening to Lordi on her like Walkman or whatever.
In the CAT scan.
On her Zune.
They're like, get it out, it's made of metal.
It breaks in the CAT scanner, and then the last thing she hears is like a note from a Lordi song.
The essence of Lordi is melded into her brain by the CAT scanner.
No, there's just like a big bang, and in that moment, that's where the whole film takes place, is in this like sort of disoriented flash. Yeah. And then she like has this whole dream sequence as the entire film, and then bang, she's like, "Oh my god, Lordi went real." I was actually a big fan of Gwar the whole time. When are we getting our Gwar film?
There probably is one.
I want to film Gwar versus Lordi.
I'd love that.
There's literally just them beating the shit out of each other for an hour and a half.
And then Slipknot and Mushroomhead show up.
Oh my god.
And they're like,
the Slipknot Mushroomhead film, that would be real animosity.
Yeah, that would be carnage.
Yeah. I think are there more members of Mushroomhead than there are Slipknot members? I think there's a good 9 versus 9.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
I know this is a huge tangent, but I just really want to see like
depends if they get to include their past members.
To be fair, Mick Thompson would beat up all members of both bands.
Just get them
combined.
in a headlock.
Yeah. I wouldn't, you've got no chance against them. Anyway, there's just a lot of missed opportunities, and coming back to what I was saying about sort of stripping away the camp from the Lordi characters. On the one hand, it makes them more malleable because they're like blank templates then. It also makes them completely generic because then they lose any sense of
they're just costumes.
Specific identity. And so you do in the kind of way they kill and the slightly different presentation of some of them. So you got the first one that appears as a ghoul, as like a ghostly apparition that they're able to fend off with like an X-ray. Then one of them kind of like headbutts their way through the bottom of an elevator. He's like more brutal and animalistic. And you got one later on who appears in like a sort of sandstorm. So there are kind of interesting ways of introducing these characters, but they seem entirely purposeless.
It's very throwaway. It's just like, and here's the next one.
Yeah.
And here's the next
Which is why, like you said, it would be more interesting if they'd been introduced as maybe some kind of sort of fictional creatures within this girl's imagination. She was just kind of like, maybe like she hates being in the hospital, right? And she has fictionalized all the various different doctors that she sees as
something like that.
Horrible, morbid versions. Like, they keep feeding me all of these horrible drugs that make me feel awful, and this one makes me feel sick, and this one always takes my blood. And so she imagines sort of specific evils that they represent, and then they come out in this.
Yeah, something like that would have been more interesting. Whereas I feel like the film it almost feels like they had just some random fucking script about like, it's just a kind of generic horror film with a time loop thrown in. And then someone's like, can we get Lordi in this somehow? Because we can't afford another script.
To my knowledge, Mr. Lordi himself was pretty ingrained into the creation of this film.
In what way?
So to my knowledge, he has like production credits and some kind of hand in the creative assembly of the whole thing.
Because watching it from the outside, it almost seems like they were like, we'll make your Lordi film, but you stay off set or else. Because like it seems so un-Lordi-ish.
Yeah, well that's what was confusing me, because it feels like, why would you make it a Lordi branded kind of thing? What's interesting about it in general, thinking about it, is where does Lordi appear in the film title? If you were branding this as here's the Lordi film, it's called Dark Floors. Who the fuck's gonna know that it's Lordi?
No, it's true. Yeah, there is no real Lordi branding. I guess maybe, I don't know. In the trailer, that obviously they show all the members. I don't know if it tells you something about how this film was promoted. I don't really know how relevant Lordi were at the time.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing. Maybe that's something we're losing or we have lost is the cultural impact at the time that Lordi would have had, particularly in Finland as well, because being a Finnish production, I'm sure they are pretty major celebrities, or certainly at the time would have been much more major celebrities over there than they would have been elsewhere.
To all other 5 Finnish people there are.
Yeah, so in missing that context, it's hard to know. Was the subtlety of their inclusion, with the branding and everything, kind of purposeful because they were already at that time such cultural icons in their local area?
I thought you were going to say to evolve their brand.
That was what I was going to come on to, is or is the alternative branching out, not sort of pinning themselves into a corner in how they're represented. I guess there's no problem with them having like all this campy music, but maybe they'd be like, but we're also serious artists as well. Look what we can do if we changed our
I just find that hard to believe when we looked it up and they'd made a disco album like last year. So I think they're just super goofy people, and this film is just a strange enigma. I don't really, in terms of the quality of it, there's not really that much to say about it. It's very run of the mill to me, but it is an interesting oddity that I think is more interesting than a lot of worse films. So like The Town, the Dreaded Sundown, which we reviewed. In some senses, A Town, the Dreaded Sundown has more technically on offer in terms of things done practically and the way, I don't know, it's shot. I think this film is very plainly shot, for example. But on the other hand, this film is much more, you could argue it's lower in quality, but it has more to offer in terms of strangeness.
Yeah, intrigue.
Yeah, so I would sooner recommend this.
Yeah, 100%. I very much doubt I'm going to return to this, but I could see myself showing someone this film and being like, this is a strange time capsule, a very specific time capsule as well. It's very European. You kind of have to know a lot about like the kind of lore of all of it. Like, if you don't know anything about Eurovision, or like, then you probably don't know much about Lordi, because outside of that, their fame has kind of receded back to their home country. It's a very bizarre film. I will say I do quite like the kind of grungy dirtiness as they go lower down into the hospital. I think there's some like nice design work going on. I don't think this film is poorly assembled on a technical level, but I think there's a lot of basic and generic elements that feel weird slapped on top of a Lordi-based film. Those two concepts just don't feel like they should have come together in that way, and they have. Like, there is a world in which this franchise became Insidious, and you have Dark Floors 2, 3, 4, The Last
Sadly,
Key,
this just didn't launch
the Ghost Portal or some shit like that.
This just didn't launch them to the international fame like it should have done.
Yeah, I know, which is a crying shame.
So anyway, what would you rate Dark Floors out of 10?
You know what? I think I'll probably give this a 5 or a 5.5 out of 10, because in spite of its generic qualities, and I know that's not like a stellar ranking or rating, but I guess kind of considering my expectations going into this, I was really expecting some bottom of the barrel garbage, and sure, as I've said ad nauseum, there's plenty of generic elements to this, but I think it functions kind of satisfyingly as a spooky haunted house type film. Some creepy designs and, a weird, if, contrived storyline, but I respect that unusualness to it.
Yeah.
What about you?
I'll give it a 4 out of 10 because I just don't think everything comes together enough for it to be like an average film, like a 5 out of 10.
Okay.
I think it's just a bit lacking. I don't see why it's so heavily panned, because I do think there is more going on than has maybe been given credit for.
Yeah, I agree.
Or maybe people are just more cynical, but I don't think it's a particularly good film, and I could only really recommend it as an oddity as opposed to like, check this film out, it's worth watching. So yeah, that's been our review of Dark Floors starring Lordi. If you like this video, give it a like. If you dislike this video, give it a dislike. Subscribe, because we have more Hooptober videos coming, and it's gonna be friggin' epic. Fucking subscribe, baby, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Peace.